George Pataki savors victory. Details coming up at noon.
The United States Capitol. It looks the way it did yesterday, but after last night, oh boy, have things changed. Good morning, America. I'm Charles Gibson. That Capitol is a very different building this morning. It is in Republican hands, solidly in Republican hands. Indeed, the House is Republican, the Senate is Republican, the majority of governorships now Republican, the nation right now, it would seem, is Republican. Joan?
All right, Charlie, just south of Washington, Mount Vernon stands as a monument to the man who for 2 centuries has really symbolized the most nobilized dreams of American democracy. And it is a fitting stop, I should say, in this election week on our great Chesapeake Bay bus tour.
It is now Wednesday, November 9th, and the Great Chesapeake Bay bus tour continues on day number 3, but this third day featuring election results. The results last night, a crushing defeat for President Clinton. He had been on the road for 8 straight days trying to stem the Republican tide. What he got instead was a Republican tidal wave. In just a few moments from the White House lawn, we're going to be talking to the Chief of Staff at the White House, Leon Panetta. Joan?
All right, Charlie, there's more to Mount Vernon than just that beautiful mansion overlooking the Potomac. During George Washington's day, this was a very, very serious working plantation. And just look around me. At that time, it was 4 farms, almost 8,000 acres, and the state was completely self-sufficient, much of its food grown right here in this kitchen garden that you are looking at, and what you see growing around us today also grew in George Washington's time. And we're going to find out more about this 18th century Renaissance man later in this hour. Spencer, meanwhile, is in another garden on this property.
That's right, Joan. I'm over in the flower garden, a flower garden dominated by boxwood hedges that were actually planted by Washington himself. And just off to my left here, behind me, a faithful reconstruction of Washington's greenhouse, which was destroyed by fire in 1835. We're going to have more and more weather in this half hour.
No,
Charlie?
Thanks, Spencer. I know that setting very well. Let's get to New York. Morton Dean standing by with the election results. Morton?
Well, Charlie, the maitre d's at Washington's Inn restaurants will have to learn a lot of new names and new faces, Republican names and Republican faces. In the House, the GOP added at least 52 seats. It needed only 40 to capture control for the first time in 40 years. And there will be 8 more Republicans in the Senate, a majority +1. And when the Republican Governors Conference is held next year, 11 more seats will be needed around the conference table. ABC's Ann Compton takes a look now at some of those Senate races.
In California, it took all night for Democrat Dianne Feinstein to pull ahead of Republican challenger Michael Huffington. She finally squeaked out a victory, saving 1 big Senate seat for the Democrats. But Feinstein was the exception to the rule for this landmark election. Senate Republican leader Bob Dole is the one celebrating this morning, and he told Good Morning America he's already making transition plans.
We've waited a long time, but that doesn't mean we're going to duck our responsibility. And I hope to call the president sometime this morning and make that point. He's the president. We owe him allegiance, some responsibilities to him, but also the American people.
Dole can look forward to leading nearly a dozen new Republican faces in the Senate. Rick Santorum in Pennsylvania beat Harris Wofford. Bill Frist trounced Tennessee's Jim Sasser. Spencer Abraham took Michigan's seat. There was only one surprise Republican casualty of the night, Oliver North in Virginia. He left survivor Chuck Robb.
How sweet it is!
The net gain of 8 new senators may give the Republicans a majority, but there's one other twist. They may get 1 new face more. Richard Shelby, a Democrat, a conservative one from Alabama, has let it be known he's going to make an announcement today, and everybody believes he's going to switch from Democrat to Republican. Mort?
And Ann, I gather we're going to hear from the president and get his spin on all this later today.
Not only will the president have a news conference, which was already scheduled to react to the race, but he's expecting a phone call from Bob Dole. We don't know of any specific meeting set up yet, but Dole and company are already talking about the transition that they are planning. President Clinton probably going to have to start from scratch on his agenda, And he's going to have to start working because the balance in power in this town starts moving immediately. It's not going to wait for January.
Right, that's for certain. Thank you, Ann. With the Republicans in control, of course, all of the congressional chairmanships will change. And among the expected Senate changes, Mark Hatfield of Oregon to chair the Appropriations Committee, Jesse Helms of North Carolina Foreign Relations, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina Armed Services, Pete Domenici of New Mexico Budget, and Alphonse D'Amato of New York to head the Banking Committee. House Speaker Tom Foley went home early this morning knowing that he was no longer Speaker, but not knowing yet whether he had hung on to his seat. It's still too close to call. Big Democratic losses in the House include defeats for former Ways and Means Committee Chairman Dan Rostenkowski and Judiciary Committee Chairman Jack Brooks. Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich will likely move into a big new suite of offices, the offices of the Speaker of the House.
It's not a Republican victory. It's not a Democratic victory. It is the American people making a set of choices.
For more on yesterday's results and what they mean, joining us now is ABC's political director, Hal Bruno. Hal, it wasn't so much an anti-incumbent vote as an anti-democratic vote.
With a vengeance. It was anti-democratic. It was anti-Clinton. I mean, we don't know of a Republican Congress member who lost, an incumbent who lost. It was only Democratic incumbents who lost. And I have a feeling that in the next day or two, when all the results are in from the state legislatures, we'll find out that it went all the way down to the state and local level. This is what usually happens when there's a big change in Congress.
Well, the president got out there. He was campaigning for those Democrats who invited him. How'd the races turn out where the president showed up?
Not too well. You know, Chuck Robb managed to survive in Virginia, but every place the president went, it was still the same old story. I don't think it's fair to say just because he went there they lost. That wasn't it at all. He tried to do the best he could, but it was a losing cause almost from the beginning because the mood, the anti-incumbency mood, had turned anti-democratic, anti-Clinton months ago.
And as Ann touched on this, a change of parties also means a change of legislative direction, obviously. Could you address that for us?
Well, it's going to be a Republican legislative agenda now, and they've spelled it out in their contract with America. They're going to go for tax breaks on capital gains. There's going to be all kinds of Reagan-type legislation that they have said this is what they want to do. I think it's going to be a very acrimonious Congress, that with all the pledges of goodwill toward each other. Don't forget we're going into a presidential year, and they're going to be playing presidential politics with Bill Clinton.
And thank you for joining us, Hal. I know you had a long night, but not as long as some of the Democrats had. Hal Bruno. In many states, there were not only candidates, but a wide range of issues that were voted upon. In California, voters approved Proposition 187 to ban most state services for illegal immigrants. Congressional term limits were okayed in Alaska, Colorado, Idaho, Maine, Nebraska, and Nevada. Casino gambling was turned down in Florida and Rhode Island, and Georgia voters overwhelmingly said yes to life in prison for criminals convicted of 2 violent felonies. One Democratic family withstood the Republican tide. Senator Ted Kennedy was reelected. In House races, his son Patrick won in Rhode Island, nephew Joe in Massachusetts. In Maryland, nephew Mark Shriver becomes a state lawmaker, while Kathleen Kennedy Townsend's bid as lieutenant governor is unresolved until absentee ballots are counted tomorrow. And here's a look at some of the events making news in the day ahead. Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrov begins a 3-day visit to Iraq. Moscow is pushing for the UN to lift sanctions against Baghdad. In Washington, this is the 10th anniversary of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And one of the most famous Impressionist paintings, Monet's Water Lilies, is auctioned in New York today. And for a complete wrap-up of the day's news and the election results, join Peter Jennings for World News Tonight. That's ABC News on the Hour. Back to Joan, still on that bus tour.
Stay. That's right. I'm here on the bus tour, out on the steps here at Mount Vernon overlooking the Potomac. It's a little breezy. Oh, yeah, that could be because of this 18th century fan chair. George Washington had one of these inside to, you know, keep him cool during those long, hot summers. But this morning it's a little bit breezier, and Spencer Christian is standing by with the complete weather forecast. This feels good, Spencer.
Well, while you're relaxing, Joan, I'm over here in the gardens. You know, George Washington maintained a very sophisticated garden. He was a progressive farmer, an agricultural pioneer. He built a greenhouse in 1785, which housed semi-tropical plants and trees. Of course, that was destroyed by fire, the original one in 1835, as I mentioned earlier, but it's been fully restored now. The gardens are just beautiful. The weather is not so beautiful. Let's take a look at what's going on around the country today. Very stormy out west. You can see by way of satellite powerful storms coming inland off the Pacific with strong gusty winds with hurricane force, rain along the coast, and heavy snow inland. That's a look at the national weather picture. Here's a look at the weather where you are.
Good morning, I'm meteorologist Bill Evans. Well, we have cloudy skies across the area with some breaks of sun, and there are some scattered showers around, but many of those not reaching the surface yet. That's falling at about the 10,000-foot level. The temperatures this hour, 63 in the city, 59 Morristown, Teterboro, 51 down the Jersey Shore, upper 50s across coastal Connecticut and Long Island Sound. Highs today will be around 70, very balmy day today, with showers moving in later this afternoon by the time you make the commute home and for tonight. Much cooler weather tomorrow through the weekend with sunshine returning.
And we'll have more weather from Mount Vernon coming up in the next half hour. Charlie?
Thanks very much, Spencer. Coming up now in 11 minutes after the hour, Bill Clinton will now enter the second half of his presidency, facing a Republican-controlled Senate. A lot of people expected that. Also a Republican-controlled House. Not many people expected that. Joining us from the lawn of the White House this morning is the Chief of Staff, Leon Panetta. Leon Panetta, I don't know what you say after this one. How did the president react last night as the results came in?
Well, Charlie, obviously he was very disappointed at the results. We knew we were going to lose some seats. That's usually the case in an off-year election, but by no means did we expect to lose the number of seats we did in both the Senate and the House. Public was obviously interested in greater change in the way Washington does business. We've now got to work with the Republicans to try to produce that kind of change.
But I'm interested in what his mood was. He had put himself on the line for the past 8 days. He couldn't have just been sitting there saying, this is obviously a sign people want more change. I suspect he must have been angry last night.
Well, he was obviously frustrated with what happened and didn't expect, obviously, as I said, the level of vote that we saw. But he's also somebody who's been in politics a long time. He's ridden through these waves before, and he knows that what goes up comes down and what's down goes up. And that's the nature of political business here in Washington.
And Leon, to what extent does he see this as a referendum on himself?
I think the president feels pretty confident that when it comes to the basic policies we put in place, certainly with regards to the economy, economic recovery, what we're doing on deficit reduction, producing jobs, almost 5 million jobs, the education reforms, the crime legislation, the trade issues, I think he does not feel that this was a vote to basically reverse that path. He does feel that obviously the public's asking for greater change in the way we do business with the Congress and in political reforms, and there we do have an obligation to try to implement greater changes, try to bring government down, try to reduce the size of government. Those are legitimate concerns that the public reflected in their vote yesterday.
But Leon Panetta, isn't this more than just a further expression of the need for change? Because Democrats got clobbered, and as far as we can tell, there isn't a single Republican incumbent governor, incumbent Republican senator, or incumbent Republican House member who lost.
Charlie, this was a sea change in terms of what the public was doing in saying that we want to give the Republicans the ability to run both the House and the Senate. There's no question about that. But, you know, there's some good news here, which is that the Republicans now have to assume some responsibility to help govern this country. The bad news is that the problems are still there and the solutions are not any easier.
There were a lot of remarks last night, and there have been on this broadcast this morning from Republicans who are saying we have to reach out to one another. There has to be accommodation. And yet we go into presidential politics now that can last a year, year and a half, almost 2 years. Immediately every Republican looking at one another thinking, are you going to run for president? No, are you? Do you really think that there's going to be a spirit of accommodation on that side? And how much of a spirit of accommodation will be on your side?
Well, I'll tell you something. The worst thing that could happen now is if those who won their seats yesterday take the American public for granted and assume that the American public was not interested in trying to deal with the problems facing this country and in trying to improve the future of their children. If all we find is greater gridlock, greater blamesmanship, greater partisanship, then mark my words, the public will vote out those that they voted in last night in 2 years. They are interested in getting something done for this country.
Of all the people I know in Washington, you're among the most optimistic. And yet I suspect your job's a little tougher the next 2 years.
Oh, yeah. No question about it.
Leon Panetta, it will be most interesting talking to you over the